Welcome to the debate, Betrayal. Can you turn emotional scars into power? Today, we analyze the ideas from the book The Alchemy of Scars.
Yeah, and we are wading into some incredibly turbulent waters today. The source material by Angel Gabriel, it makes a claim that is, well, it's as seductive as it is controversial. The idea that the most shattering moments of a life, infidelity, abandonment, deceit, are not just injuries to be healed, they're raw materials. The whole premise is that we can and should alchemize this trauma into a source of, quote, inner magic.
It is a bold stance. Absolutely. The framework here is really built on this fascination with one's own resilience. Gabriel takes this ancient metaphor of alchemy, transmuting lead into gold, and applies it to the psychology of betrayal. The argument is that betrayal inflicts a visceral shock, a seismic roar that just levels your reality. And my position here is that passive recovery, it just isn't enough. You can't just glue the vase back together. The material argues that we must use the heat of that destruction to forge a completely new, unstoppable self.
Right. And on the surface, that is a compelling narrative. I mean, who doesn't want to emerge from the ashes like a phoenix? But this is where I have to pull the emergency brake. We are talking about trauma. The text lists gaslighting, emotional manipulation. These are assaults on reality itself. So my concern, and the core of my position today, is that this framework risks slipping into a kind of toxic positivity. It demands that a victim, who may barely have the energy to get out of bed, suddenly has to perform magic on their pain. I mean, is it healthy to tell someone in the throes of grief that they need to become a visionary?
I appreciate that caution, and it is a necessary check. However, I believe that interpretation misses the structural depth of the methodology. This isn't about slapping a smile on a wound. It validates the shattering blow, and it acknowledges the shattered mirror of self-worth. But my argument is that without a rigorous, structured path forward, validation just becomes stagnation. If you don't have a plan to rebuild, you remain a victim of the event. The alchemy described isn't mystical thinking. It is a cognitive methodology for reclaiming agency when you feel completely powerless.
Okay, but I'm not disputing the need for agency. I'm disputing the cost of entry. The concept promises a journey from, brokenness to unstoppable empowerment. That is a massive cognitive leap. It presumes the injured party possesses this high-level executive function, the ability to plan, to regulate emotion, to reframe narratives, at the exact moment their brain is flooded with cortisol. My stance is that these tools, while they sound good in theory, might just become burdensome expectations that make a survivor feel like a failure if they aren't alchemizing fast enough.
Well, then let's move beyond the theory and test the actual mechanics proposed, see if they hold water. The first major hurdle the philosophy addresses is what it calls the emotional labyrinth. The core argument here is about disidentification. We have to stop identifying as our feelings.
You're referring to that distinction between saying, I am sad, versus I am feeling sadness.
Precisely. It's a technique called mindful observation. The argument is that when a survivor says, I am sad, they're merging their fundamental identity with a temporary state of pain. And that merger is what leads to the festering wounds you're concerned about. The proposal is to create a safe space, a physically designated private area, to sit with raw emotions, observe them, label them, and then step back. It's a containment strategy.
But let's look at the practicality of this safe space. I'm skeptical that simply sitting in a room and staring at your grief actually constitutes processing for everyone. For a lot of people, that solitude doesn't lead to observation. It leads to rumination. It becomes wallowing. The framework suggests designating a time to cry. To me, that sounds incredibly clinical for something as messy as heartbreak. And then we have the grounding techniques, the 5-4-3-2-1 method. Find 5 things you see, 4 you touch. Is that actually effective during a flashback, or is it just a distraction technique?
It is absolutely not distraction, it is physiology. And this is a crucial distinction. When someone is spiraling, caught in the tidal wave of anger or the fog of disbelief, their sympathetic nervous system is in overdrive. They are effectively offline. They are dissociating. The 5-4-3-2-1 method, or the breath anchor, it forces the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, to re-engage. You cannot consciously count 5 blue objects in a room and remain fully dissociated at the same time. It forces a neural reconnection.
I'll concede the physiological validity of grounding. Sure, it can work to lower your heart rate. But I worry about the context. The framework presents these tools as part of cognitive restructuring. That implies a level of control that just feels contradictory to the chaotic experience of grief. If I'm in the middle of a visceral shock, telling me to focus on the texture of my jeans might feel, well, minimizing. It risks engaging the brain while ignoring the heart.
I disagree. I think it's giving you a handle to hold on to when the floor drops out. You can't process the heart if the brain is offline. And that stability leads directly to the next and maybe the most actionable pillar of this philosophy: rebuilding your kingdom. This is where the alchemy shifts from internal processing to external action. The proposal is very firm. You have to forge new boundaries to protect your energy.
Okay, forging new boundaries sounds noble in the abstract, but the implementation described here is incredibly rigid. The metaphor of a kingdom implies walls, guards, a moat. The suggestions include limiting screen time after 9 p.m., rigidly saying no to draining friends. I mean, we have to consider the target demographic here, young adults. For this group, connection is currency. If you follow this advice and cut off everyone who drains you while you're in a crisis, you aren't rebuilding a kingdom, you're building a solitary confinement cell.
I think that is a misinterpretation of the red flags framework. The proposal isn't to cut off support. It's to filter out interference. The philosophy explicitly distinguishes between a friend who is difficult but well-meaning and what it calls insidious enemies. We're talking about protecting oneself from gaslighting and emotional manipulation.
Definition of those terms can get so blurry when you're hurt and defensive. A friend telling you a hard truth might feel like an attack in that moment.
Perhaps, but the framework gives clear markers to aid that discernment. Does this person deny events happened? That's gaslighting. Do they use conditional love? That's manipulation. My stance is that you cannot heal if you are still drinking poison. Personal sovereignty means you have the right to close the drawbridge at 9 p.m. if digital interactions are triggering your anxiety. That isn't isolation, that's self-preservation.
I see the value in protecting oneself from abuse. That's non-negotiable. But the list includes abandonment by friends as a betrayal. If I start rigidly enforcing boundaries with my social circle because I'm hypersensitive from a romantic betrayal, I might inadvertently push away the very village I need. That energy drains concept worries me because sometimes a friend is draining because they're holding a mirror up to our behavior. If I just classify that as a red flag and cut them off, I'm isolating myself in an echo chamber of my own pain.
That's a valid concern, though I would frame it differently. The proposal encourages discernment, not blind rejection. It asks you to assess, do I feel energized or drained after interacting with this person? If you're constantly drained, that relationship is not sustainable, regardless of whether they're right. And this need for discernment leads us to the most controversial part of the philosophy, but also, I think, the most powerful, the shift from victim to visionary.
I knew we were getting there. This is where the whole alchemy metaphor goes into overdrive.
It is the core thesis. This is the concept of post-traumatic growth. The argument is that we can and must rewrite the narrative. We stop asking, why did this happen to me? And we start asking, what can I build from this? The survivor rewrites the ending of their story. They visualize themselves not as the person who was cheated on, but as the person who survived it and gained wisdom from it.
And that is where I have to push back hard. Rewriting the narrative walks a very fine line next to delusion. The framework suggests a visualization exercise where you see your scars as profound markers of wisdom. That sounds beautiful, poetically. But does it let the perpetrator off the hook? If I decide my partner's infidelity was actually the catalyst for me finding my true purpose, aren't I essentially saying, thank you for abusing me?
Absolutely not. That is a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept. The philosophy is very clear on self-compassion versus self-pity. It explicitly separates the betrayer's actions from the victim's worth. You aren't thanking them for the harm.
You're refusing to let the harm be the final word. You are taking the debris they left behind and building a house. That is what the visionary does. They don't deny the fire happened, they just decide to build a fireproof structure next time.
But the framework also suggests looking for lessons, like clearer discernment. If I tell a victim of professional deceit that they need to find the lesson in their trauma, I am implicitly suggesting they played a role in it. If only I had better discernment, this wouldn't have happened. It risks validating that internal critic that's already asking, was I not enough?
Actually, the proposal directly attacks that internal critic. It calls out the shattered mirror effect, where we project blame onto ourselves. The lessons are not about blame. They're about future armor. Learning to spot inconsistent stories or defensiveness, which are listed as red flags for infidelity, is a skill. Acquiring that skill is a form of power. If we deny the victim the chance to learn that skill because we're afraid of blaming them, we leave them vulnerable to it happening again.
That is a compelling argument for future protection. But have you considered the timing? This philosophy pushes for this shift to visionary status relatively quickly. It talks about intentional living and SMART goals for your future. But when you are in the visceral shock phase, you can't make a SMART goal. You can't even make a sandwich. My fear is that by holding up this visionary ideal, we make people feel like failures if they're still just angry 3 months later.
I think the framework acknowledges that the timeline isn't linear. It mentions the ebb and flow of healing. But let's talk about that anger, because it segues into one of the most contentious points, the liberating power of forgiveness.
A gift to self. That's how it's framed.
Yes. And the argument is that forgiveness has nothing to do with the other person. It is untethering from bitterness. We have to look at the physiological benefits, cardiovascular health, reduced cortisol. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. The proposal is to release the blame, not to excuse the act, but to free your own system from the stress of carrying it.
I am sorry, but I just don't buy the rush to release. Anger is a protective emotion. It is there for a reason. It signals that a boundary was violated. If we use this alchemy to prematurely transmute our anger into peace, we might be bypassing a necessary stage of grief. Sometimes you need to be furious. You need to hold that person accountable. This idea of releasing blame feels like it shortcuts justice.
But does holding on to the anger actually achieve justice? Or does it just keep you emotionally tethered to the perpetrator? The argument is that it only imprisons the victim. And more importantly, it brings up self-forgiveness. This is crucial. Often, the person we are most angry with is ourselves. For trusting, for staying, for not seeing the signs. The methodology argues we must release the internal critic that says, I should have known better.
I can get on board with self-forgiveness. That is vital. But the proposal links it to perceived roles in the betrayal. It asks us to acknowledge our perceived role without judgment. And that's tricky territory. If I was gaslighted, my role was being the victim of manipulation. There's nothing to forgive myself for, other than maybe being human. I worry that framing it as forgiving my role subtly validates the gaslighter's narrative that I was too sensitive or crazy.
I see it differently. I think forgiving your role means forgiving your vulnerability. It means saying, I trusted, and that was a beautiful thing about me, even if it was weaponized against me. It's about reclaiming your innocence so you don't become hardened and cynical. And that is the ultimate goal of the alchemy. It's not just about surviving, it's about living your empowered truth.
Sustaining the magic?
Exactly. The final argument is that this isn't a one-time fix. It's a lifestyle. It combines this mystical language, inner magic, with incredibly practical tools. Vision boards, values alignment, SMART goals. It suggests that betrayal clears the deck. It forces you to look at your life and ask, is this authentic?
I will give you this. The tools are practical. SMART goals are effective. Vision boards work for many people. My skepticism isn't about the tools. It's about the packaging. Calling it magic and alchemy dresses up hard, painful work in glitter. It implies that the outcome, unstoppable empowerment, is guaranteed if you just follow the recipe.
But isn't that what we need? A blueprint?
When your life has been blown apart by a seismic roar, you don't need someone to just sit there and nod while you cry. You need a map. You need to know that there's a destination called visionary that is better than where you are now. The glitter, as you call it, provides hope.
A map is good. A mandate is dangerous. I think the ideas presented offer a rigorous discipline, yes, but I would argue that sometimes scars don't turn into gold. Sometimes they just turn into tough skin. And that's okay too. You don't have to be a visionary to be healthy. You can just be a person who survived.
That's a fair critique, but I would argue that the attempt to turn it into gold is what makes the survival meaningful. The philosophy challenges us to use the furnace of experience. Even if you don't become a superhero, the process of trying, of grounding yourself, setting boundaries, aligning with your values, it leaves you better than you were.
Better, perhaps, but different. I think that's the one thing we can agree on. Betrayal fundamentally alters the structure of the self. The shattered mirror never goes back together exactly the same way.
No, it creates a mosaic. And that's really what this methodology is proposing. It's a guide to making that mosaic beautiful rather than just jagged.
So where do we land? Is this philosophy a manual for the brokenhearted or a pressure cooker for the traumatized?
I believe it is a necessary, rigorous discipline. The language is high-flown, yes. Alchemy, kingdom, magic. But underneath that, the framework is solid. It moves you from the passive why me to the active what now. The tools from the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding to the red flag identification are things every young adult should have in their kit. It transforms the echoes of a broken promise into a blueprint for intentional living.
And I'll concede that the utility of the grounding techniques and the red flag analysis is undeniable. We need those skills. However, I maintain a strong caution. The pressure to be unapologetically empowered shouldn't replace the basic human need to grieve, to be messy, to be unproductive. Use this as a toolkit, absolutely, but don't treat it as a mandate for immediate transformation. If you can't alchemize your pain today, that doesn't mean you're failing. It just means you're healing.
A valid caution. Ultimately, the question the alchemy of scars leaves us with is profound. When the floor drops out, is the goal of healing to return to who you were before the fall? Or do you use that fall, that furnace of experience, to forge something entirely new, even if the process burns?
It's the difference between restoration and renovation. One fixes the past, the other builds the future.
And this approach is definitely in the business of renovation. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the mechanics of betrayal and power.
It's been a fascinating debate. Until next time.
Take care.